On a quiet July morning in Clearwater, Florida, one of the most recognizable men on the planet stopped breathing. Within hours, the news had reached every corner of the world. Hulk Hogan, the wrestler who had once carried an entire sport on his shoulders, was gone. What followed was not a quick, quiet closing of the book. It was nearly a full year of medical records, family statements, a malpractice claim, an inheritance dispute, and a police file that eventually ran more than 70 pages. This is the real story of what happened to Terry Gene Bollea, the man the world knew as Hulk Hogan, and why his death stayed in the headlines for so much longer than anyone expected. On July 24th, 2025, emergency crews were called to a home on El Dorado Avenue in Clearwater after a 911 call reporting a medical emergency. Hogan's wife, Sky Daly, was on the line, telling dispatchers that her husband did not appear to be breathing. At the house that morning were Daly, a home health aide named Dana Swinton, and an occupational therapist, Justin McCamey, who had only been working with Hogan for about 2 weeks and had arrived roughly 10 minutes before Hogan collapsed. The three of them began CPR before firefighters and paramedics arrived and took over life-saving efforts. Hogan was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors continued to try to revive him. At 11:17 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 71 years old. Word spread almost instantly. Wrestlers, actors, politicians, and fans who had grown up watching him tear off his shirt in the ring posted tributes within the hour. WWE released a statement calling him one of the figures who had carried the company to global recognition in the 1980s. For a generation of fans, it felt like losing a piece of their own childhood. The earliest official word on the cause of death came from the Pinellas Pasco County Medical Examiner's office, which ruled that Hogan had died of an acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack. On paper, it looked like a straightforward tragedy. An aging former athlete's heart had simply given out. But almost immediately, family members and people close to Hogan began raising questions that would keep the case open for the better part of a year. To understand why investigators didn't simply close the file after the autopsy, it helps to understand what Hogan's body had already been through. Decades in the ring had left him with damage that required more than 24 surgeries over his lifetime. Hips, knees, his back, his shoulders. That much had long been public knowledge, discussed openly in interviews throughout his later career. What was not public until after his death was that Hogan had been quietly battling chronic lymphocytic leukemia, a slow-moving blood cancer, for some time. He also lived with atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm that raises the risk of stroke and sudden cardiac events. Sky Daly later told police that in the weeks before his death, Hogan had also undergone heart surgery and, roughly 6 weeks prior, a significant procedure on his neck, a multi-level spinal fusion to relieve pressure on his cervical spine. Individually, none of these conditions was a secret bombshell. Together, they painted a picture of a 71-year-old man whose body had been absorbing serious medical stress on multiple fronts in the final months of his life. A heart condition, a blood cancer, and a major spinal surgery, all stacked within the same short window. It's the kind of medical picture that makes a sudden cardiac event less mysterious and, at the same time, invites a harder question. Did one of those recent medical interventions play a role in what happened next? That question centers on a small but critical piece of anatomy, the phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm and, by extension, a person's ability to breathe. During complex neck surgeries like the one Hogan underwent, surgeons operate in close proximity to nerves that regulate breathing and heart rate. If a nerve like this is nicked, stretched, or otherwise damaged during the procedure, it can lead to breathing difficulties that may not become obvious until some time after the operation. According to police interviews, it was Hogan's own occupational therapist, Justin McCamey, who first raised the possibility that Hogan might have been the victim of a surgical complication. McCamey told responding officers that he had heard a surgeon may have damaged Hogan's phrenic nerve during the earlier neck procedure. That single detail, relayed secondhand by a therapist who had only just started working with Hogan, became one of the threads investigators felt obligated to pull on, given how prominent the man at the center of the case was. This wasn't a fringe theory invented by outsiders. Hogan's own wife took it seriously enough to pursue it through the legal system. Sky Daily has indicated she intends to pursue a medical malpractice claim connected to the surgery. And in the months after Hogan's death, the family filed a petition asking Florida courts for a 90-day extension on the statute of limitations so they could properly investigate whether any of Hogan's medical providers bore responsibility for the circumstances leading up to his death. That is a civil matter separate from any criminal investigation, but it's a real, still unresolved thread in this story, not idle speculation. Here is where the real story diverges sharply from the rumors that spread online in the months after Hogan's death. There was no FBI takeover of the case, no secret room full of blackmail files, no disabled security system, and no untraceable midnight phone call documented in any police report. Those elements circulated in sensationalized social media videos, but they don't appear anywhere in the actual investigative record. What did happen was more grounded, and in some ways more interesting because it's real. The Clearwater Police Department kept its file on Hogan's death open for nearly a full year. Given Hogan's fame, and given the malpractice questions the family itself was raising, investigators felt they had an obligation to run those concerns to ground rather than simply accept the initial heart attack ruling and move on. As the department later put it in its closing report, it fell to Clearwater Police to address, challenge, or validate some of the concerns in the case, and doing that thoroughly meant interviewing multiple witnesses and reviewing recordings and records tied to Hogan's final days. That included interviewing McCamey about what he'd heard regarding the phrenic nerve. It included pulling together Hogan's medical history, the leukemia, the atrial fibrillation, the recent heart procedure, the spinal fusion, and having medical experts weigh in on whether any of it, alone or combined, could account for his sudden collapse. Sky Daily and Hogan's son, Nick, also arranged for a private autopsy, separate from the medical examiner's official report, specifically to get an independent answer to the malpractice question the family was already pursuing. The private autopsy's conclusion was unambiguous. Hogan died exclusively from compelling natural disease, with no reasonable traumatic or terminal toxicologic contributions. In plain terms, nothing found in that examination pointed to trauma, poisoning, or surgical injury as the actual cause of death. His heart had failed on its own, driven by the conditions he'd already been living with. Because the investigation stayed technically open, and because police were careful not to release sensitive medical details while the malpractice question was still being sorted out, there was a long stretch of time where the public had almost no new information. That silence is exactly the kind of vacuum that internet speculation rushes to fill. In the absence of a clear final statement from police, theories about hidden motives, secret rooms, and shadowy phone calls began circulating on video platforms. Dramatic narratives built almost entirely on invention rather than anything in the case file. The reality, once the police finally closed the case in June 2026, was much less cinematic and far more human. The 72-page final report from the Clearwater Police Department stated plainly that there had been no evidence to indicate Hogan's death was anything other than natural, and no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing connected to it. Officers publicly thanked the Hogan family, Sky, Nick, and Brooke, along with their attorney, for cooperating with the investigation, noting that police wouldn't have had the legal ability to access much of the sensitive medical information without the family's consent. Some material, including certain security footage and detailed medical records, was withheld from public release, which is standard practice for sensitive personal health information rather than evidence of a cover-up. In short, the department did exactly what a responsible investigation should do when a public figure dies under circumstances that a family member has flagged as medically questionable. They took the malpractice concerns seriously, ran it down for the better part of the year, found nothing that pointed to foul play, and said so clearly when they were done. No discussion of Hogan's final years is complete without his complicated family life, because it shaped so much of what came after his death, including who would inherit his estate. Hogan's first marriage, to Linda Claridge, lasted more than 2 decades and produced 2 children, Brooke and Nick. That marriage became publicly known to millions of Americans through the reality series Hogan Knows Best, which aired starting in 2005 and presented the family as a stable, if eccentric, unit. Behind the scenes, the marriage was unraveling, and Linda filed for divorce in 2007 after infidelity allegations became public. Hogan later spoke candidly in interviews about how deeply that period affected him emotionally. He remarried in 2010 to Jennifer McDaniel, a relationship that lasted roughly a decade before ending quietly in 2021. In 2023, he married Sky Daly, a yoga instructor, in a relationship that moved quickly and that Hogan described as bringing him a sense of calm and stability in his later years. Brooke's relationship with her father grew more distant over the final years of his life. According to Brooke's own public statements, the estrangement stemmed from disagreements that had become emotionally taxing for her, compounded by a high-risk pregnancy that led her to step back from the relationship. In 2023, Brooke asked to be removed from her father's will herself, by her own account, out of concern that she might get pulled into a legal or financial dispute after his death, and out of broader concerns about people in her father's orbit. That is an important distinction from the narrative that sometimes circulated after his death. This wasn't a case of Hogan cutting his daughter out in anger. It was Brooke's own request, made 2 years before he died. When Hogan's will became public, it confirmed that Nick was named the sole beneficiary of an estate that included roughly $5 million in various assets, cash, cryptocurrency, personal and intellectual property, and rights to Hogan's publicity and likeness, plus an unresolved amount tied to the still-pending malpractice claim. Sky Daly was listed as his surviving spouse, a legal designation that carries certain protections but is distinct from being named a beneficiary. She was not listed as one. Brooke, in keeping with her 2023 request, was not listed as a beneficiary either, though Hogan had arranged for her to receive money through a separate life insurance trust, which she has said she intends to put toward her children's education. Notably, Hogan's real estate holdings, including his Florida properties, reportedly worth around $11 million, were held separately, likely through a trust or LLC, and weren't part of the estate filing at all. Brooke did not attend her father's funeral in Largo, Florida, in early August 2025, but she posted a heartfelt tribute afterward, saying she chose to honor him privately in a way that felt most genuine to her. Months later, in an interview, she admitted she had come to regret removing herself from the will. Not for financial reasons, she said, but because the decision left her with no legal standing to access information about her father's death, including autopsy details, at a time when she desperately wanted answers just like everyone else in the family. When the Clearwater Police Department finally announced the case was closed on June 5, 2026, almost 11 months after Hogan's death, it marked the end of one of the longer-running investigations into a celebrity death in recent memory. Not because of any hidden criminal plot, but because the family had specifically asked authorities to dig into a genuine medical question, and doing that properly took time. The department's own language was direct. The case would be considered closed and solved, non-criminal. The malpractice question remains a separate, ongoing civil matter, one that Sky Daly has indicated she still intends to pursue. But as far as any criminal investigation into Hogan's death itself, authorities found nothing. It's worth stepping back from the paperwork and the legal filings to remember why any of this mattered enough to make headlines for nearly a year in the first place. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestler. He was, for an entire generation, the reason professional wrestling became mainstream American entertainment. His body slam of Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3 remains one of the most replayed moments in the sport's history. Performers like Dwayne Johnson and John Cena have talked openly about how Hogan's crossover fame built the stage they eventually stood on. Off the mat, his television ventures and his larger-than-life persona made him one of the most recognizable faces in American pop culture for 4 decades. That legacy is why a heart attack in a Florida home became international news, why a family's private grief became a public medical and legal story, and why so many people wanted a more dramatic explanation than the one the evidence actually supported. Sometimes the truth is simply that a 71-year-old man who had already survived leukemia, an irregular heartbeat, and a body rebuilt by more surgeries than most people could imagine, finally ran out of runway. The mystery here was never a conspiracy. It was a family trying to get honest answers about whether a recent surgery had contributed to his death, and a police department that, out of respect for both the man and the questions his own family was asking, took the time to find out. Hulk Hogan's ring career ended years before his life did. But the way his final year played out, the surgeries, the malpractice questions, the family rift, the long investigation, and finally the quiet closing of the file, is a reminder that even the most famous exits rarely wrap up as neatly as the headlines suggest. What is certain is that his impact on wrestling and entertainment is permanent, even as the more personal chapters of his story. The malpractice claim, the family's